Hello, and welcome to the July 2025 meeting of Triangle Association of Freelancers. Our guest this evening is hurricane expert Jay Barnes. Jay has studied the storms that have impacted North Carolina and Florida for several decades. He writes and lectures about our rich history with hurricanes, and his books, 15 Hurricanes That Changed the Carolinas, Powerful Storms, Climate Change, and What We Do Next, North Carolina's Hurricane History, Florida's Hurricane History, and Faces from the Flood, Hurricane Floyd Remembered, not only feature meteorological records and accounts of physical damages, but offer amazing human stories of rescue, survival, and recovery. There are many lessons to be learned from recent hurricanes like Floyd, Irene, Matthew, and Florence, but a look back at the great storms of the past offers a long-term perspective on the nature of our hurricane threat. Jay's books remain a fascinating and relevant accounting of the history of those great storms. Jay, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Don, thank you for having me. Uh, I will go ahead and try to share my screen here. See if this will work for us. And
There we go.
is everybody seeing that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm going to start by just a little bit about myself. I grew up in Southport, North Carolina, down at the mouth of the Cape Fear River. And I always like to begin any kind of presentation I'm doing by first emphasizing that I'm not a meteorologist. I never studied weather science. That really wasn't my thing. I ended up, as I said a moment ago, I ended up working with the North Carolina Aquariums for many years and enjoyed that tremendously. But I got into hurricane history just because of my love of local history. Down at the coast, there's a lot of history there with the Civil War and the pirates and so much to talk about. But what I think one of the things that really cemented it for me was as I was growing up, I heard so many stories about Hurricane Hazel. Hurricane Hazel was a fascination of mine, even as a young person. Even though it came ashore in '54, which was years before I was born, um, all of my neighbors, my parents, a lot of people around Southport talked about Hurricane Hazel all the time. Just for reference, Hurricane Hazel is the only Category 4 hurricane ever to strike North Carolina. It came ashore in October of 1954, right about the South Carolina line, right around Little River. And it was devastating, not only here in our state and through Raleigh, I should add, but as it continued on northward and into the Northeast and then ultimately in Canada. So it was an epic storm that really piqued my interest as a young person. And as time went by, and I think actually the aquarium had something to do with this, we were running a Hurricane Awareness Week there at the aquarium, and I started doing slide programs about some of our history. And it led ultimately to my first book, which was North Carolina's Hurricane History. And it came about, I guess, as a realization that the subject that interested me, there you could dig into some of the National Weather Service records, but there wasn't any popular way or any easy way to learn about the storms, not all consolidated in one place. So I kind of realized that it was a niche that probably needed to be filled. And I was so interested in all the storms, not just Hazel, but the other storms of the 50s and even going back to the 19th century. Tried to dig up all the newspaper articles and collect all the photographs I could. And one day I ended up with a big fat folder of this information, and I went over to visit with the folks at the University of North Carolina Press in Chapel Hill, and I said, I've got this idea for a book about North Carolina hurricanes. And they liked the idea, and we were off and running. And one of the things that came true pretty quickly is that when you write a history about a subject that is continues to unfold, then you're never finished because there's always another storm just around the corner. And as I said, collecting the photographs was a big part of it, and spent a lot of time in libraries and archives. And I should add, this was all back in the in the mid 90s. So this was before the internet. I really did a lot of the old-fashioned way of uh, going to visit museums and libraries and newspapers to rummage through their old photo files and their clippings, and ended up with just a wealth of information about the storms that had rolled through North Carolina over the years. And so I pulled all that together and wrote the book, and then we started having more storms. Bertha and Fran came the very next year in 1996. I did an updated edition, which came out in 97. And then here we come with Hurricane Floyd in 1999. And so it was a sort of a realization that it's a history that continues to unfold. And so ultimately, the book ended up with four editions. The fourth edition is the current edition, and it includes Matthew and Florence, which are really the two big storms of late. So I think what one of the things that I guess I took it on as a project because I had a passion and an interest in it. I will add that this wasn't my day job. As I said, I was working with the aquariums at the time, but it gave me a project to work on that I got a lot of satisfaction out of pulling all these stories together, interviewing people, collecting the photos, building a case for each particular storm. But then also, I realized that I was learning a lot. I had to really become somewhat of an expert on the meteorology side as well as the history side. So I spent a lot of time with friends and colleagues in the National Weather Service and the Hurricane Center. I still have good friends down there. So it was a learning process for me, was equally important to any product that I was producing. I really enjoyed the learning process. So the fourth edition, as I said, has been out for some time. And then along the way, there were several other books that came along. I mentioned the Florida book. One of the things too was it's challenging to write a book about a subject in another state when it's not easy to travel there, or it's expensive to travel there. So I did a lot of this work remotely, but Florida's hurricane history was the next project, and that came out originally in 1998 and then an update in 2008. So second edition is the current edition of Florida's hurricane history. All of these published by the University of North Carolina Press. Um, and then there were others that came along the way. I ended up doing a book for Arcadia on Hurricane Hazel because I had such a wealth of photographs that I'd collected, and it's mostly a picture book. And then I think you mentioned, Don, Faces from the Flood was really another project that I jumped into with both feet. It was right as Hurricane Floyd was savaging eastern North Carolina in September of 1999 that I started interviewing people pretty quickly. But then I got a call one day from Richard Moore. Richard was the state treasurer at the time, but he had been involved with, I guess it's Department of Public Safety during Hurricane Floyd. So he was front and center for a lot of the Hurricane Floyd disaster. And he asked me if we could do a book together. And so we worked on that one. And that one's very different from my other books because it's all first person. I did something like 67 interviews all across the state, mostly in places like Greenville and Tarboro, Rocky Mount, New Bern, Kinston, places that were hit hardest by the floods. And it was just an emotional roller coaster, frankly, to talk to these folks who had lost so much, or responders who had, climbed down ladders out of helicopters to pull people off their rooftops, that kind of thing. So Faces from the Flood is really a very special book to me. And one of the things that I would also add is that as time goes by, I realized that I was much more interested in not just the history, and the ways that storms have impacted us over the years. But I wanted to also start to build a case for what are the things we've learned? What are the lessons learned from storms years ago? And there are many. And one of the things you've heard this quote before: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Unfortunately, we see that all the time, where we are really not always learning all the lessons that we should. The newest book, 15 Hurricanes That Changed the Carolinas, came out in 2022. So this is the newest publication that I have, also with UNC Press. And this one's a little bit different because what I did was I chose 15 great hurricanes that have impacted North Carolina and South Carolina. It's for both states. And then really what I wanted to do was to take an approach of, okay, what are the things we've learned? What were the takeaways from each of these storms? And for each of the 15, there are several bullet points of things that we either learned that we didn't know, or in some cases, they're just fundamental observations that are really critically important for us to never forget. And that included a look at climate change and the way that our climate is going to be affecting these storms in the future. So it's a history book that realizes the lessons learned, and then it looks to the future at what we can expect in the decades to come. Now, most recently, of course, we've all had our eyes turned towards the western counties in our state in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. And Hurricane Helene is a storm that will go down in history as the most deadly hurricane in North Carolina's history. Although the figures aren't all in, it's likely to be the most costly hurricane in our state's history. And it's in a place where we don't normally associate with hurricanes, and that is in the mountains of our state. And so we've all seen these images of how severely flooded Asheville and other communities all around the mountains, even into Tennessee, were hit by the floods that came from these tremendous rains. Even this was Helene had struck down on the Florida coast, of course, and then came up our way. And this is a repeated pattern. This is something that's happened before. And I was talking about the lessons learned. Many people you saw it on the news who were living in Asheville. They just said, "Well, we had no idea that something like this could ever happen here." They really were sort of bewildered by the fact that they thought that Asheville was be a fairly safe place to live with regard to climate. But if you go back to my book and look at the July storm of 1916, you'll find that Asheville was hit by the Great Asheville Flood, but it was over 100 years ago. And so there's no one in Asheville today that remembers that storm. So unless you go back to the history books and really study it, you wouldn't know about the Great Flood in 1916. And by the way, the water level on the French Broad River in Helene was only about 13 inches higher than in 1916. But in 1916, it was an equally devastating storm, washed out all the railroad trestles and bridges in western North Carolina, really shut off that part of the state for a matter of months as rebuilding tried to take place. So that's just an example of how some of this history can easily be forgotten. And that's really what's motivated me to bring it to the forefront, to remind people that that disasters like this, even though for where you live, it might be once in a generation or more, it still can be a threat. And so most recently, my new book project, which I've got underway right now, turns back to Florida, and it's the same idea. It will be called 15 Hurricanes That Changed Florida, and it will be a look at the 15 greatest hurricanes in Florida's history with the same type of takeaways and the same kind of look to the future. And I'd say I'm about 2/3 of the way through with working on that project. Probably the book probably won't be out until 27, but it's again, it's the kind of thing that I'm hoping that some of the readers of this new book will have their eyes opened a little bit about some of the great storms of the past and what's taken place. And certainly with storms like Helene and Milton and Ian and Michael and some of the other big hurricanes they've had in Florida just in the last 5 or 6 years, there are a lot of new stories to be told, stories of survival, people who, unfortunately, just tragedies of not only a loss of life, but also people who have economically lost their homes, and really had no way to rebuild. I mean, it's a very sad story when you start digging into the insurance factors and the ways in which we try to recover from major hurricanes. We know the struggles in Western North Carolina. In Florida, they have the same kinds of issues. So, Don, that's my real quick whirlwind tour through my work. I've included my email address here on the screen in case anybody is keenly interested in learning more or has other questions to follow up. Feel free to send me an email.
Jay, thank you so much. These are some amazing photos you had in your presentation here from previous storms. Just some really emotional images there. I was curious, what is the oldest recorded hurricane, bad hurricane in North Carolina history? Do you know?
Well, there are. Um, I will say that one of the references that I use a lot was David Stick's wonderful book, Graveyard of the Atlantic. In it, there are storms that date back to the 1500s that were chronicled, even with John White's voyages to the New World and the development of the Roanoke colony. There was actually a June hurricane that struck that area in, I believe, can't remember the year, it might have been 1583, but it's that's probably one of the earliest ones that we know about. But it stands to reason that every century there have been so many storms. But one of the problems with documenting this history is that in this era of New World exploration, the 15th and 16th centuries, and even into the 17th century, there were very few settlements here in North Carolina, or very few. The population was so low, there weren't a lot of good ways to record what was happening, or maybe a storm would strike and it wouldn't affect anyone. And so there's much that's not known about those earlier storms. As you go through time, it stands to reason. You go through time. By the time you get to the 19th century, and then of course the 20th century, then we have a pretty good handle on every storm. But prior to that, there are a lot of storms that I'm sure that were missed.
What would you say was the one storm that offered the greatest number of lessons when it comes to meteorological events like this in North Carolina? Is there one particular storm to you that was like the textbook of like, we learned a lot from this one, and hopefully we'll use that knowledge moving forward?
That's a great question, Don. I think the storm that kind of comes to mind is Hurricane Floyd. And the reason for that is that we're all familiar with the Saffir-Simpson scale. It's kind of a scary thing. You think about a category 1 all the way up to a category 5 hurricane. And we tend to think of storms in those terms of, oh my gosh, I'm glad we've never had a Cat 5 here in our state. How devastating would that be? But a big lesson learned with Hurricane Floyd, I think, is that even a Category 1 can be an epic disaster. It wasn't a windstorm; it was the rains. Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Matthew, much the same way. They were not powerful windstorms. Florence had a fair amount of wind, but both of those, both or all three, Floyd, Matthew, and Florence, three of our biggest hurricane disasters in our state, they were flooding events because of copious rains that fell over a period of days. You have to kind of discount the category of a storm like that. And with in the case with Hurricane Floyd, it was a Category 5 sitting off the Florida coast. As it was heading our way, we were really worried that we were going to have another Hazel on our hands. But what happened was the storm weakened considerably. Hour by hour, it got weaker. By the time it got to North Carolina, it was no longer the big, powerful storm that it had been. And everyone kind of let their guard down. And a lot of people went to bed that night thinking, oh, well, we dodged one this time. But it turned out to be a great disaster. A lot of people that I interviewed for the Floyd book, um, or a couple of people told me that the way that they knew that they had a problem was they were asleep and they woke up and they realized their backs were wet because water had quietly entered their homes. The power was out, but the water had entered their homes and gotten up to the level of their bed, and woke them up. And that's a scary thought to think about a storm like that.
That's wild. Floyd was actually my wife's and my greeting to North Carolina. We moved up here in the spring of '99 along with Mark and his wife also. And all I remember is it took out my shed.
Yeah,
But yeah, that was a very, and I know that was an extraordinarily, it was was a cat one, you said, but the rain was what made it such a devastating situation.
yeah.
Jay, I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about your research process for the books that you've written, if you wouldn't mind. I'm curious how you gather the information, the people or the agencies that you talk to for these particular kinds of books.
Yeah, that's a great question too. Well, as I said, I've been doing this long enough that I predated the internet age. So I can remember driving to Asheville to visit the National Climatic Data Center. Happens to be in one of the big federal buildings in downtown Asheville. That's the repository, and Mark would know this. That's a repository for all of the nation's weather data. It's now been renamed the National Center for Environmental Information, but they were very helpful to me. The folks at the National Hurricane Center have been my friends for a long time, and they're, one good thing about meteorologists is they do write things down. They keep weather records that we can go back and look at even decades later. And a little publication put out by the Weather Bureau, as it was called, the monthly weather review, includes a month by month description of everything that happened, what the wind speeds were, how much rain came through. But that only started sometime probably around the 1890s. When you go back prior to the 1890s, then you have to really dig a little deeper. And one of the things that I like to say, Don, is really anybody who writes history, um, that we stand on the shoulders of those that preceded you. And there are some great weather historians, even in the early 20th century and in the late 19th century, who had compiled some of the information. So how did I know about the storms of the 1500s and the 1600s? Some of it I was able to pull from a place like the Wilson Library, but there are a lot of that information was contained in books that others had written. Um, Now, in more recent times, and with not traveling as much, I can get a lot accomplished by talking on the phone and doing Zoom calls like this. And the interviews that I've done over the years have been some of both. Some have been by phone, but many of them have been in person. Those that in North Carolina with Hurricane Floyd, most all of those were interviews done in person. So I did a lot of traveling around to talk to people. Um, the photographs are another big part, and unfortunately, one of the realizations that I came across early was that newspapers aren't real good at archiving anything. Most newspaper organizations, they're there about this week, and they take pictures and then they move on to next week. And so, unfortunately, some of the great newspapers in our state don't really have much in their files. But fortunately, the North Carolina State Library or the State Archives has obtained like the News and Observer's photo records. And so I was able to go to them and obtain a lot of good images. But it just depends on the storm. It depends on what you're writing about. I know that I mentioned Hazel a moment ago. Hazel actually killed more people in Canada than it did in the United States, believe it or not. And there's a wealth of information that I was able to pull from some of the resources available, government resources available in Canada for that storm. For these newer books, the storm, the 15 hurricane books, both North Carolina and Florida, it's a lot of interviews, talking to a lot of experts, trying to certainly on the meteorology side, climate scientists, but also people who work in resilience, and that is to help us make our homes and businesses stronger, help us better survive storms. A lot of different government people. The emergency manager for Pinellas County, Florida, was one of my interviews last week. So really, a lot of it is just tracking down the right people to talk to, and then getting a good chance to hear them out, and then incorporating their viewpoints into what I write. That's a fundamental part of what I'm doing right now.
What for the kinds of books that you write, Jay, what are the most common challenges that you face as an author, as a writer and a researcher?
Well, it may be the biggest challenge is when you're trying to research something from long ago. As I just mentioned, storms from uh, you know previous centuries, you don't have a lot to work with. In some cases, you might not know. You might have two conflicting reports. But there's so much fascinating details I learned along the way. Like for example, I didn't know until I dug into this that Benjamin Franklin is credited with one of the most important hurricane discoveries ever. He was living in Philadelphia, and he was very interested uh, in some kind of solar event or something going on in the skies. I forget what it was, and he realized that a storm came. And it was a tropical storm moving through, and the clouds came up, and he wasn't able to do his observing. And then he talked to one of his colleagues in Boston who reported that this same tropical storm had arrived in Boston like 9 hours later. And that was the first time anybody realized that hurricanes and tropical cyclones actually move from point A to point B. Christopher Columbus wrote about his first encounter, which wasn't until his fourth voyage, and his in his letter to the Queen of Spain was that I'm never going to sail to this longitude and latitude again because I've lost two ships and 12 horses and 40 men or something like that. So there's a lot of the evolution of meteorology to be captured as we move through the centuries.
That's awesome. Um, I did not know that about Benjamin Franklin, but that's kind of an important observation right there.
Yeah, it is.
Um, Jay, is the weather that have experienced over the last couple of years, in your opinion, is this our new normal? Should we be aware of and prepare for more storms, stronger storms, or is this just a passing meteorological phase? What are your thoughts on that?
Um, well, Don, I'll answer it this way, and I'll first again restate that I'm not a meteorologist or a climate scientist, but I can tell you some of what I've learned. One thing is that it's dangerous to make any assumptions by trying to evaluate the climate based on the last couple of years. You can't really do that. The climate is set up such that that change generally happens over a longer period of time. On the other hand, what we know from climate science that's being research that's going on right now is that Earth is getting warmer. Our oceans are getting warmer, and sea levels are rising, and alarmingly so. The trajectory for what's happening is going to have a mounting impact on our weather in the future. It's a little bit dangerous, though, to turn back and point to a storm like Katrina and say, "Oh, that's climate change that made that happen." That's not really a fair way to evaluate the situation or the data. So what we have to realize is that warmer air and warmer water means more rainfall for storms. And with Hurricane Florence, maybe that's the first example. Florence broke the record for the amount of rainfall to ever fall in North Carolina, something like 41 inches of rain down near Elizabethtown. So we can see this change is incrementally happening, but it's a little bit dangerous to point to climate change and say that's the reason. And the reason I say that is we could have easily had a Hurricane Florence in 1898 or 100 years ago. So I think one of the things I like to say is that yes, climate change is going to have an impact, and it may be having an impact now, but it still is an evolving process to figure out how much of it is devoted to the fact that our climate is changing and how much of it is naturally occurring, because we've always had hurricanes and we've always had big bad hurricanes. So it's sort of I realize that's a wishy-washy answer maybe, but there's true science into what we know is going to happen in the future. Now, one of the interesting things from the models that the National Hurricane Center is running is that In the average Atlantic season, we now have something like 14 named storms on the average each year and 7 hurricanes on average. Uh, in the future, they expect, even by 2100, those numbers are probably not going to change that much. The number of storms is not likely to increase. They also are anticipating, according to their models, that the effect on wind of making them stronger is probably only going to be about 5% by 2100. That's not a very big increase. That means a 100 mile an hour hurricane today might be a 105 mile an hour hurricane by 2100. Now, that's directly from the lead researchers at the National Hurricane Center running these computer models that try to predict the future. But it also is telling us that we'll probably have more high-end storms like category fours and fives. We'll see storms accelerate, or I should say, strength and intensity more quickly, and we've already seen that just in the last couple of years. And then but the real kicker is that, and we can all expect this, it's already happening, is that our hurricanes are going to become wetter. They're going to produce more rainfall because warmer air, in fact, the more temperature you add to the air, the more moisture it will hold, and the more rain will fall. And so we can expect more Florence type hurricanes in North Carolina in the years to come.
Spooky. Jay, do you do any writing outside of the books that you've published? Do you write for magazines or any publications in particular?
I do, Don. I haven't lately, but over the last 20 plus years, I've written for Our State quite a bit. I've written for North Carolina Wildlife quite a bit, and the topics are very diverse from everything from venomous snake bites to the Mako light. If you know what that is, it's probably one of North Carolina's most famous ghost stories, and I happened to encounter it growing up in Brunswick County, and wrote for Our State magazine about it. A lot of other topics over the years. So yes, I enjoy that kind of thing, but just haven't done much of it lately.
Gotcha. And before I turn this over for audience questions, I was curious, what is the strongest hurricane you personally have experienced?
That would have been Hurricane Fran. And what was interesting about that was that I was living in Atlantic Beach, Pine Knoll Shores, in 1996, and Fran made landfall down near Carolina Beach. So it was a fair bit south, but it was a powerful enough storm. It was a Category 3 at landfall, which is a major hurricane. And my home in Atlantic Beach was rocking and rolling. The skylights we were afraid were going to bust out. I had the kids in the sleeping bags on the floor, and of course we were without power for a long time, and it tore things up pretty good along our beach, even though we were, what, 90, 100 miles north of where the worst of the damage was.
That's great. Well, not great, but I'm glad you got through it okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Jay, this has been just fascinating. It really is. As someone who was born and raised in Florida and has been through their share of hurricanes over the years, it's just something that is part of your genetic makeup, I think. And I appreciate you joining us so much. Does anyone else have any questions for Jay about his books, about hurricanes in general? Anybody?
I have
And
one.
Don, I think there's some in the chat as well.
Yeah, okay. Tara, you go first. Let me see who's got some chat questions.
Jay, what I noticed about your book, I'm making my way through your latest one, 15 Hurricanes, is you have a lot of data, but you managed to somehow balance that data about the storms with personal stories and information about the people in the area. And as a writer, how do you go about balancing that?
That's a great question. You're onto something there, though, Tara, because if the book was just about the meteorological facts and figures, um, it would be pretty boring. The personal stories and amazing personal stories. Sometimes they're tragedies. Sometimes they're even funny stories that happen. They really help to round out what it means to have a hurricane experience, because it's not just about how much rain falls or how high the water was. If you're flooded, you're flooded. And for those people who suffered through these floods or suffered losses, family members, as we have had in certainly Helene recently and many other storms. You always have to do it with a lot of respect to treat the subject and what when you're talking about loss of life in particular. But I think balancing it is you hit it right on the head. You have to. I try to shape the narrative so that you're not overwhelmed by statistics, and you really feel for the people who are going through what they went through, and let them tell their story in their own way. In some cases with quotes, but in other cases just by describing the events of what happened to them. And there's people are so willing to tell hurricane stories. When I do lectures, typically after every lecture, I have people come up and they want to tell their story because they remember where they were during Hurricane Fran or during Hurricane Floyd or maybe Hazel, and everybody's got a hurricane story, it seems. So those kinds of stories are important to capture, and a lot of what you read in my book, frankly, are in many cases they're stories that I've heard over the years from people talking to me after presentations.
Jay, Sherry was wondering when we started naming hurricanes.
Oh, that's a great question. So during World War II, in the late 40s, in the Pacific, a lot of Navy meteorologists were trying to keep up with typhoons, and in some cases you'd have four or five going on at once, and they were radio communicating with each other, and it got confusing. So they started giving them their girlfriends' names as a way to tell them apart, and that's how a lot of this started. And after the war was over, these meteorologists came back and started working with the Weather Bureau. So it wasn't until 1950 that the first names were given, but they were not official. They were only inside for the workers in the Weather Bureau to understand which storm they were talking about. And it was usually Abel, Baker, Charlie kind of naming. Um, and that's why you've got, like in 1950, for example, Hurricane King was a big storm in Florida, but it's not it wasn't an official name. The official names began in 1953. And in 1953, the decision was made to use ladies' names for all the storms. And that continued from 1953 all the way to 1979, which you might recall was the peak of the women's movement, if you want to call it that. And they were lobbied very hard that they needed to balance it out and use men's and women's names for hurricanes. And wouldn't you know it, the two storms that struck the United States that year were David and Frederick.
Nancy was wondering, she said, you mentioned patterns being repeated. What are some of those patterns and lessons learned?
I mentioned patterns being repeated. Um, well, it may be, I'm not exactly sure what I meant. Maybe what I was referring to is that in some cases we don't learn the lessons that we should, and we repeat the pattern of bad behavior, like for example, not evacuating from an evacuation zone. There's so many examples of how people have lost their lives because they thought, oh well, it probably won't be that bad. We'll just stick it out, and I don't want to leave my house. Being trying to be tough and hang in there, and if your home is flooded or washed away, that can be a tragic thing. And there are lots of social scientists that have looked at this issue, and they've found that it does tend to repeat. There are even the most recent storms in Florida. If you go and look at some of the fatalities from storm surge from Hurricane Helene in the Bay Area, they were people who just refused to evacuate. They wanted to stay in their homes and see what it was all like, see how bad it was going to be, and they ended up paying for it with their lives. That's one of the kinds of patterns I'm referring to. Now, there's another kind of pattern that is a little more complicated to explain, but I'll try to make this brief. Um, there's there's something called the AMO. If you want to Google it, it's the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, and it's believed to be a 30 to 40 year pattern where we have warmer ocean temperatures followed by cooler ocean temperatures. Now, climate change is really messing that up right now because we're all getting warmer temperatures. But historically, there have been patterns where we would get hit by a lot of storms in a short period of time, like the 1950s, where we had something like 9 hurricanes in North Carolina in 10 years, followed by the pattern during the cool phase from 1960 to 1984, we virtually had no hurricanes for 24 years in North Carolina, none of any consequence. So you can have you can have these shifts of weather patterns that are not necessarily associated with climate change, but they are related. And the AMO is something you can Google and read about yourself.
That's great. Does anyone else have any questions for Jay? Oh, Sherry, you had your hand up?
Yes, I was wondering, how do you prepare for a storm when the one that hit us the worst was Irene, and it was a category 1. And of course, we had been through worse storms, so we didn't really think anything about it. I mean, it just sat out in the sound for 2 tides, and it was the tides, that did all the damage. But
Yeah.
how do you prepare for something like that?
Well, it goes back to something, Sherry, that I said just a moment ago, is that that Saffir-Simpson scale, it gets more credit than it's worth. The scale of 1 to 5, we don't have to worry so much about getting a Cat 5 here in North Carolina. But on the other end, you have to really watch out. A category 1 can be a devastating storm, and Irene is another great example. Slow moving storms that go through more than one tidal cycle is another big problem. A storm that arrives on a full moon high tide like Hazel is another big problem. And so, how do you prepare? I think that the one of the things I put in my book, I was talking about the importance of elevation for the floor level of your home. Everyone should know the ground floor elevation relative to sea level if you're near the coast or near a river. I say that a lot of realtors focus on location, location, location. They should be thinking about elevation, elevation, elevation. Because even with a storm like Florence, in places like Lumberton and Fayetteville, where severe flooding took place from those rivers, it's elevation that is causing these people to, lack of elevation is causing them to flood. And our storms, we're going to see more storms like that cause the rivers to rise beyond anything you've seen in recent times. And that's really the lesson: is you have to be prepared on that way. And then the last caveat I would throw in there is that so many people that have been devastated by these storms, like Florence or Irene, did not have flood insurance. And flood insurance is not cheap, but if you don't have it, you're not covered for what happens when the water rises.
And see, a lot of places around here aren't even allowed to have flood insurance.
Anyone can have flood insurance.
From what I understood, after the Irene, they wouldn't allow flood insurance for some of the places in this area.
Well, what you're referring to is if you're at a low elevation, you couldn't get flood insurance on that property unless you lifted it up, raised it
Yeah,
up. That's what you're referring to.
yeah,
So anyone can have flood insurance, but yeah, if you're at a low elevation already, then the National Flood Insurance Program is going to say you have to elevate your home in order to have the insurance.
yeah.
Joel?
He's
Joel,
he's
you're
muted.
muted.
Okay. You mentioned that we'd have more rain, in the future. And that's a very interesting comment. A close friend of mine is an atmospheric physicist who works for the EPA. And she was telling me people don't understand how much influence wildfires have on major events. That that as the atmosphere heats, you will see more extended, like, half of Canada or whatever, burning, and that promotes more rain. So the prediction from the EPA locally is that in the future, at some point, Raleigh and most of the Southeast will be having lots more rain. It'll be warmer, and therefore we'll be more tropical than we are now.
Yes, that's my understanding as well.
Does anyone else have any questions or thoughts? Tara?
Yes, a couple of questions. One, with all the research you've done, have you come across topics that you like to write about that just came out of the research you did for the books? And two, since you said that you're a historian and not a meteorologist, have you found yourself in conflict with meteorologists who may question some of your findings?
Well, those are great questions. I think as far as other topics go, because I have diverse interests, when I launch into a book project that's maybe 3 years in the making, it's all consuming. And when I get done with it, I don't want to think about hurricanes. I'd rather move on to do something else, to paint or do some other creative thing. Um, so, so no, I don't know that I'll be doing a whole lot more hurricane books. I think that once I finish this one, I'm probably going to turn my attention in other directions. As far as conflicts go, this is a natural part of science. If you understand science and the way science works, um, science is based on scientific method and development of theories and the proving of those theories with data. And one of the things that happens in this age, especially once it's become politicized, is that things like the climate and what our temperature might be in the future is debatable. Are we going to get more hurricanes in the future? Anyone can debate it one way or the other because no one knows for sure. All we can do is use our best computer models to try to make those predictions. So I don't know that I've run into a lot of conflicts. Although that AMO that I just mentioned a moment ago, there's some out there now who are saying that the AMO may not be real. It may have been a bit of a misunderstanding, and that actual climate change may be having a bigger impact on that than we realize. So I'm still sort of sorting that out right now, but that's just one scientist's view versus another. I try to be neutral and interested to learn as much as I can.
Okay.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, Jay, this has been absolutely fascinating. I'm so glad you joined us this evening. I could talk about this topic for a million years. And I think one of the probably the most devastating hurricane that Mark and I and our families dodged a bullet with was Hurricane Andrew in 1991. That made a slight jog to the east, I think, and missed Palm Beach County and instead slammed into Miami-Dade County instead.
Yes.
And I know we all know how devastating that particular hurricane was to South Florida and the impact it had on so many different kinds of industries down there. Could you talk a little bit, just for a real quick moment, talk a little bit about Andrew and what made it such a unique storm?
Well, Andrew was uh, in as bad as it was, Don, it could have been so much worse because it was a very small storm in diameter. Really one of the smallest hurricanes that you can imagine making landfall in terms of the total diameter from one side to the other, such that because it struck below Miami, downtown Miami, and then thus Fort Lauderdale and areas north were spared. The real example that's the worst case to look at is the Miami hurricane of 1926, which was a category 4, not quite as strong, but it was a large, powerful storm that went right through downtown Miami and then crossed over and eventually hit on the Gulf Coast as well. And so Andrew was an epic storm in so many ways because it still hit a very densely populated area. It was for a long time, until Katrina, it was the most expensive hurricane in U.S. history. Um, but it was not a worst case scenario, like a lot of people think about, because it struck a less populated portion of southern Dade County down near Homestead,
Mhm.
and it really spared the more densely populated areas to the north. So it still is a monster. It's included in my list of 15 great hurricanes for sure, and it still generates probably as much interest as any storm in Florida's history.
I interviewed an exotic bird breeder in Miami for Bird Talk magazine shortly after the storm, and her business was devastated. She lost a tremendous amount of her stock, either killed or just kind of disappeared. She didn't have enough insurance to cover for the damages. It was really horrific for her. And unfortunately, we're talking about this, and she's brave in the moment, but she just collapsed into tears after a few minutes of us talking. It was a very difficult and emotional situation, and I know she's not alone. That hundreds and thousands of other people went through exactly the same thing,
Yeah.
and Florida's not alone in that either. All of us get this. Jay, this has been wonderful. Again, our sincere thanks for joining us. This is the part of our meeting where we kind of share good news, where people talk about sales and things they've got going. If you'd like to stay with us a couple minutes, that'd be
I'm gonna have to break away, but Don, thank you so much for having me.
absolutely.
Best wishes to all of you, and you should have my email address if anyone has further questions.
Thank you so much, Jay. It was great having you. I hope you have a great week. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you all. Bye bye.
Take care.